Hello everyone, welcome to the first ISHQ event of this semester. ISHQ, as you all know, is an acronym that stands for Issues in Society, History and Queerness. And through our conversations at these events, it allows us to think rigorously about issues of gender, sexuality, desire and politics. For our first event today, we have with us the wonderful Tejaswini Niranjana. Tejaswini is the director at the Center for Inter-Asian Research and Dean of Online Programs at Ahmedabad University. She is also the co-founder of the Center for Study of Culture and Society at Bangalore. Apart from numerous published works in acclaimed journals, she is currently part of a multi-sited ongoing research project which explores questions around digital intimacy, experiences, and relations in the current age of social media and smart cities. Before I hand over to Tejaswini, I would like to briefly go over the format of today's talk for our audience. Tejaswini will be speaking for about the first 30 to 40 minutes, after which we will open the session for a Q&A with the audience. You can post your questions at any time of the talk using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will try to take as many questions as possible in the last 15 to 20 minutes of the session. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tejaswini, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. So this is not the kind of PPT where you will get sound bites. I'm just going to show you a few images to set the mood for the talk and the discussion to follow. So let me just do that. Thanks to the colleagues at Ashoka University for inviting me. This is probably just the second or third time I'm speaking on this topic. And I'm trying to gather, what impressions people might have, which will fold back into the ongoing project in a way. So I really look forward to the discussion after my remarks for about 25 to 30 minutes. So let me just run you through the slides. This just to say that, we had a lot of discussion about emojis during the interviews, and I thought it's appropriate to begin with that. As you can see, that different kinds of Asian women, all doing the same thing, as no doubt all of you do as well. So here we have WhatsApp and WeChat or Weixin. WeChat is commonly used in China and in some of the diasporic communities. These you'll be familiar with. And Weibo would be the equivalent of Twitter in China. This is just some random images from Zoom dating, which also we talked to our interviewees about. Yeah, so that's all I have to show you. And I think let me now begin my presentation. I'll read bits of it because I want to keep the time carefully controlled. So here goes. Let me introduce the project first. It's a research project I put together with colleagues from Bangalore, Singapore, Hong Kong, Guangzhou in southern China, and New York. And this project began with the premise that young women are often at the cusp of radical social transformation, never more so than in the contemporary world. We want to think about young women as central to the digital mediation of close relationships that's dramatically changing the landscape of intimacy. So we understand intimacy in this project as closeness, familiarity, and attachment across a spectrum of relationships, including the familial, the peer-based, and the romantic or sexual. So how do young women understand and experience intimacy in the age of, I'm sorry about that. How did that happen? Yeah, how do young women understand and experience intimacy in the age of social media and digital communication? Are their experiences qualitatively different after the millennial turn and the enormous expansion of digital technologies in everyday life? I'm painfully aware that many of you may have actually been born after the millennial turn, so this might just seem like common sense to you. But we're trying to understand through a comparative lens how this might work in different spaces in Asia. So I would call this an inter-Asia research project. And we are looking at young college-going women in the 4 cities where the investigators are located. I've already mentioned them, so-called smart cities: Bangalore, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Guangzhou. We want to argue that digitally mediated intimacy has an impact on how millennial women experience, understand, and negotiate family, marriage, tertiary education, which for us are these 3 foundational social institutions that seem to be undergoing rapid transformation. The age group of women 18 to 30 in the study encompasses the generation usually characterized as being the most active agents in the digital ecosystem. Our research project is not yet fully underway, but we did carry out a pilot study this past year to understand how their lives, how the young women's lives in these aspiring cities, smart cities, are being shaped by the phenomenal growth of digital technology use in Asia. Just to give you a few numbers, in 2017 alone, Asia accounted for 70% of the total annual growth in internet users globally, and now hosts more than half of the world's online population, almost 50% of whom are women. So there are 2 billion internet users in Asia, and China by itself has about 980 million internet users. Just a word about what I call inter-Asia referencing. We have a comparative focus, which enables us to explore possible differences within Asian contexts in relation to digital mediation. So the 4 chosen sites are important nodes within national or regional and global configurations and circuits of culture, economy, and technology. Multi-sited research in Asia, we want to argue, enables us to analyze how such circuits intersect with local/national contexts and histories without making the West the default reference point. I can speak more about this unique focus of ours and the inter-Asia referencing in the discussion if anyone has questions. So the methods we use for the study, although it involves a large number of us humanities people who are not used to working collaboratively and not used to certain kinds of social science research methods, but I think that, willy-nilly, all of us are anthropologists, we do ethnography. So the methods we use include qualitative ethnographic interviews, participant observations or going-alongs, and empirical tracking of self-reported data usage. We place our questions about the present in a historical context, trying to understand where our subjects came from and how those locations and histories may impact their digital preferences. We also explore how the current socio-political situation in each place is transforming young women's digital usage and digital choices. Contrary to a popular assumption that the algorithms behind digital platforms, especially mega platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Snapchat, or their Asian variants, WeChat, Weibo, Line, or Kakao, contrary to the assumption that these create a certain homogeneity in patterns of usage, we want to think that we'd like to point to significant local variance. Such variance, we want to argue, is based on a number of factors. Let me just list them here, just a few of them. Diverse local cultural histories that translate into digital habits, as well as the emergence of new sites of protest and expression of disaffection with the worlds that young women occupy. B, conditions of access, including access to various social and cultural liberties, along with safety restrictions that limit access in both physical and virtual spaces. These are different across the 4 locations. It's likely that various apps are specifically designed to work with on and offline practices, mapping these onto socially defined physical and virtual spaces. C, another issue that might involve a lot of variance across the sites are legal and technological restrictions that we are quite familiar with in India, but are also quite in common in all the other locations, such as firewalls, such as internet shutdowns that we are now familiar with, that create new conditions for innovation, such as hacking, bypassing, or jumping, and that may also have social consequences. D, trajectories of technological development and internet culture. And here I'm thinking of whether local alternatives existed before the global norm emerged, or whether significant alternatives exist parallel to these mega platforms. For example, in Hong Kong, there is something called the Hong Kong Golden Forum, which is basically only for a local audience, a Cantonese speaking audience, serving a particular purpose that can't be fulfilled by so-called universal platforms. So there would be many forums like this in each locale. Lastly, but really a very, very important factor for me in particular, is that the languages people use online are also major indicators of local variance. What I'm speaking about today draws primarily on 40 interviews conducted in Bangalore, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, and Singapore over the last year, in the pandemic year, 10 in each place. So given the travel restrictions imposed by the pandemic, many of these interviews were conducted online, although in Hong Kong and Bangalore in particular, we could do some of them offline between lockdowns and quarantines. Assembling detailed ethnographic information helps us to grasp the specificity of different Asian locations and to analyze the mundaneness, the everydayness of the digital as it unobtrusively transforms social relations and institutions. It's possible that this everydayness can't be adequately captured in online interviews, because after all, those are only for a short time, like an hour or so. And again, the relationship between online and offline can't be understood in all its complexity if you're only conducting the interviews online. We are hopeful that before the current project ends, we have another 2.5 years, we will be able to visit each other in our 4 locations and sit in on each other's offline interviews. In today's talk, I also want to draw on some pre-pandemic interviews from 2017 onwards, when about 24 interviews were conducted face-to-face in Hong Kong and Guangzhou in a precursor project. So I'm going to jump now to a few things that we noticed, some preliminary findings. The first of these has to do with negotiating digital boundaries. So what I'm getting at here is that in order to understand the formation of what we've called zones of intimacy in our project, we spoke to interviewees about boundary drawing and boundary maintenance in the digital world. Another way of describing this might be to talk about the curation of digital content on different apps. So how do young women draw boundaries of what to share and what not to share? Who can see it and who cannot? I'll just quote from some of the interviews. One person said, when we asked, can your family see your Instagram posts? She said, no, I blocked all of them. Another person said, parents can see most of my posts except those updated after midnight. And I think this person who was 18 did not want her parents to know that she's awake after midnight. So she just keeps posting for a long time, but she is able to block them after that. Students often block teachers and mentors too, from seeing certain kinds of posts that might seem transgressive, even of something as minor as dormitory rules. I have in mind the woman who was using like a hot pot to cook something in the dorm for a late night snack and did not want teachers and mentors to know that. The communication with such people as teachers and mentors is also carefully curated. A student in Guangzhou said, when we're texting with teachers and seniors, we send stickers gingerly. We take everything down a notch. We use very polite stickers. So although blocking of family members is commonly practiced, I'm sure all of you know this, digital mediation helps young women to communicate with their parents in a way they would not do offline. One of the young women interviewed says she often sends her parents a heart on WhatsApp or sends a text saying, I miss you. She says, face to face, I would never say I love you or miss you. There's another only child in Hong Kong who lives with her mother in a slightly large house. She uses WhatsApp to communicate with her mother, even though they're in the same house. They sleep in the same room. But sometimes she says, when my mother falls asleep and I want to show her a picture or something, I won't wake her up, but I send her the image on WhatsApp and she will see it when she wakes up. So they live in a 3-story house. So sometimes if they're on different floors, they will send messages to each other on WhatsApp. Some routinely switch between platforms, sometimes simultaneously. One woman speaks of texting on Signal with her friends and discussing another topic with the same people on Instagram. Another mentioned that during the Hong Kong protests in 2019, she continued her everyday posts on Instagram. She was sort of an influencer, although she was active in a different way on Twitter. She did not want people on her IG account to know what her political opinions were. So different platforms may thus serve different audiences. At the same time as boundaries are being drawn as to who can see what in terms of the content. Different platforms may also be used for the same people by creating a hierarchy of apps, as in this example from Hong Kong. A young woman streams the men she meets on Tinder onto different apps. When they're asked to move to a different app, I quote here, "For people I have the best conversation with, I can let them follow my IG account, as IG reveals details of myself and my life. If the conversation is okay but not very good, I can share my Signal or WhatsApp contact. If the conversation is not good, then goodbye," unquote. So while IG or WeChat may enable curated publics for users, young women are also part of online family groups, friend groups, bestie groups, and work or class project groups. This is common across the locations, with the communication platforms including WhatsApp, Telegram, and Signal in Hong Kong and Singapore, WhatsApp and Signal in Bangalore, WeChat, Weixin, QQ, and Weibo in Guangzhou. So we were asking how are existing relationships, family, school friends, best friends, how are they redefined or reconfigured in the digital domain, which also includes many people who don't fall into these categories. For example, there's a Hong Kong student who has an Instagram account that she says is privately public. It has 554 followers and 157 posts. She has another account that's private with 19 followers and 1,359 posts. And she has a third account that she uses for stalking ex-boyfriends. Another Hong Kong student has a private account with 200 followers. Yet another one in Singapore has a private account with 1,000 followers. A student in Bangalore had in 2020 one IG account for her photography portfolio, one Finsta or fake account for goofy selfies and friend pictures, and one account which became a protest account, where she posted and reposted information on a daily basis during the anti-CAA demonstrations. Judicious use of social media tools enable young people to efficiently manage their zones of intimacy by helping them to create and maintain new boundaries. Most of the young people we spoke to, however, acknowledged the openness and publicness of social media platforms. Whatever they post or write or share, they are hyper aware that people will be looking at it, whether friends, acquaintances, family, police, or the government. Using WeChat is like running naked, said one. So let me move to the next focus of our interviews. We were trying to find out what would the interviewees consider to be digitally intimate behavior. One of them said that they share all aspects of their life through text messaging with their best girlfriend. In turn, I quote, "The girlfriend sends me pictures of every meal she has." They chat every single day. That's for them is intimate behavior. There's another person who sends articles, poems, and book reviews to her boyfriend, which are only for his eyes. And they use the Discord app to watch movies or read together online. Another young woman likes to send funny images to her friends. What she does is she says, "I capture their ugly faces when I see them online. I make them into sticker packs and I send them back." For her, this is a very intimate kind of behavior. Moving to another aspect of digital intimacy, someone said at a certain stage in a relationship, there are things you can only say online. Another student who's a rugby team captain has to control her emotions on the pitch, but she types long messages yelling at people after a match, people in her team with whom she's very intimate. She says that venting online is quickest and easiest. After I type it out, I'm done with the situation. Another said that to express hurt, when she's feeling heartbroken, when she's feeling very hurt, it's easier to type this out than to speak it. But one would only text it to someone because of being intimate with them. When we ask, is there a difference between how you chat with them online and how you talk to them face to face, that is your intimate others, one student said, "In Telegram, I use only text. If you're discussing an issue, you can say it point by point, and it is very clear. Face-to-face, on the other hand, is so complicated. Sometimes when you have deep feelings, you cannot talk to him or her in person. Then you type a message. Our interviewees are actually divided on this point. Some say that complicated conversations are better face-to-face, or if a misunderstanding occurs on messenger apps, like communicating via text, sometimes they pick up the phone and call the friend or the lover to resolve the problem. We did ask everyone how much of their interaction with close friends is online. And the typical answer is the interaction is every day throughout the day. But physically, we only meet once a month. During the pandemic, the interaction online increased to a greater extent as opportunities for face-to-face meetings diminished. For greater privacy in intimate relationships that were not known to the family, students texted each other for hours under lockdown rather than do video calling. One of our interests is in trying to understand the relationship between online and offline behavior. So we are trying to ask, does online behavior mimic offline interaction? If so, to what point? Where and when does it become something else? We are still trying to gather enough data to understand how this works. One of our examples is of this young woman who posts constantly about feminism and the 2019-20 political situation in India. For her, the endless political arguments with her family members are an expression of closeness and intimacy. So disagreement as intimacy is also an interesting way of looking at it. We were talking to someone else who was very involved in the anti-CAA protests and in street politics in Bangalore. And we asked whether the intimacy that the person established with people, over the political questions that they were engaged in, is it facilitated by online interaction? And I quote here, this is what the person said: "I think online is the way in which we got to know each other. And we arrived at that place, but it wouldn't have sustained itself beyond that. If I hadn't known these people and seen them on the field and seen what they are, that is, seen them in protests. Because the point for me to use Instagram was to move this advocacy to the ground. I'm using IG to weed out the people who are just talking about things and doing nothing, and then to see who actually comes." So this person was very clear about the relationship between online and offline. There's enough evidence from our interviews so far to show that people's understanding and experience of intimacy has definitely changed in the wake of digital communication. Digital apps enable us to share instantly, real-time, and often free of charge our most mundane day-to-day activities and thoughts. It's like thinking out loud, as one of the interviewees said. One of them shared micro details about what she was feeling or doing or thinking in a steady stream. Maybe you can call it microblogging. The rhythm that you build up through microblogging is relevant to intimacy. So this person spoke about talking around the clock to her boyfriend. When the boyfriend was in a less demanding job, we were basically constantly thinking aloud to each other. Every other thing we notice, we will share with each other. We just want to type down the thought and tell the one next to us, but because he's in town somewhere and I'm on the bus going home, so I just text. Now he's in a more demanding job, so I don't mind that he replies to my messages. But before, it was like a constant flow of communication between the two of us, as long as we were awake. So I think what we see here is digital communication that is not finite and not purposeful is a marker of intimacy in this example, and in many others that we came across. So I'll come now to the language question. How do these mostly trilingual and sometimes polyglot women use different languages to convey what and when? Most interviewees made a distinction between using English, which they were familiar with mostly from university contexts, as in Hong Kong and Guangzhou, and many more used it fluently, as in Singapore and Bangalore. So, but they did make a distinction between using English and using a mother tongue or another local language in digital interaction. In all 4 locations, the gaps between interaction in English and interaction in a local language were sometimes seen as productive. I quote, "I prefer using English when I talk about something emotional because I want to detach myself from it. Chinese is more intimate." So this person wanted to create distance in an emotionally intimate situation in order to handle the intimacy better. In Singapore, an interviewee said that for her, the Malay word sayang, makes someone feel close rather than the English word love, which is not really intimate. It was common in her circles to say, I sayang you, rather than say, I love you. Another said she prefers to argue or fight with someone digitally in English, but use Malay to express love or closeness. Here's an example from Guangzhou. There was this young woman who was not very comfortable in English. In fact, we interviewed her in Mandarin. This is what she had to say about her relationship with her long distance boyfriend. This is before pandemic time. So they were in the same town, they used to live together, and then he had moved away to another town for his studies. So she says, before, when we used to write to each other in Chinese, I felt there was a lot of difference or gap in terms of the logic. So I couldn't understand what he was trying to say. I tried to write things in simple words, but he said he couldn't understand. So eventually we decided to use a language that we both can't use very well, that is English. So what happens when they use English with each other is they tend to repeat what each other is saying. She says, I miss you. He writes back saying, I miss you. But if they say the same thing in Chinese, he would not say back, I miss you. When they used WeChat and they wanted to say, I love you in Chinese, they would try to avoid the situation because it's not very comfortable for them to use that. But now with email, when she says, I love you in English, he replies immediately, I love you too. So I think these are some of the examples which are circling around how people draw boundaries, how people are configuring zones of intimacy, how this is actually reconfiguring relationships with family, with friends, with lovers, with other kinds of intimate situations with peers. I think that we try to pull out some of the things that might lead us in a direction where we will be able to say at the end of 3 years that, yes, we do feel that social institutions in themselves have actually changed as a result of digital mediation. So let me sort of wind up here and conclude by saying that this very preliminary study has focused on the reconfiguration of certain modernist categories of public and private, self and the social, inner and outer, presence and absence as a result of digital intermediation. We found that relationships with friends and lovers and with family members seem to have already changed, even in the last 10 years or so of digital usage, which is within the memory of the young women we talked to, some of whom have had an online presence since the age of 10. The digital has afforded new avenues and new modes of communication and connection, even as it has modified older ones. Although young people may live in congested urban locations and continue to live with their families in just a few square feet of space, especially in a place like Hong Kong, they create virtual homes to inhabit, in which they curate their privacy through digital filters. Cross-language communication is an emergent phenomenon that seems to work in the digital domain, even when it cannot work in face-to-face interaction. Interviewees also commented on the nature and flow of conversation being different online, and how they used emojis and stickers to direct the flow or to put a temporary halt to a chat. The halt is only temporary because no one ever switches off their phone or goes offline. You check in online when you wake up. Most of your daily life is lived through the phone, and then you go to sleep with the phone by your bed. One of the interviewees said, if I wake up in the middle of the night suddenly, I will check my phone. And I think she's speaking for many, many people in the audience. The smartphone, as it's becoming quite obvious, rather than any other modes by which we access the internet, has become in our time the object physically closest to us, with which we are actually quite intimate. This is the object that contains as well as mediates the crisscrossing engagements with the many worlds of our technosociality. So it's not a conclusive conclusion, so to speak. I'm very happy to answer questions to the best of my ability. I do want to tell you that we are a team of 10 people, several investigators and several research assistants, some of whom might well be in the audience. It's the first time I've tried to coordinate such a large project involving so many sites and so many people. So I won't necessarily be speaking for all of them, but I'm happy to address the questions to the best of my ability. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Tejaswini. It's been a wonderful talk, and I think it's put into perspective for all of us the ubiquity of the digital internet age that we're living in and our digital social interactions and intimacies that are created. So, our first question is about the idea of consent in the digital space. Because we've been talking about digital intimacies and how women are navigating this on social media. So, do you think the idea of consent has been complicated in the digital space, and how would you say it is different from a non-digital environment?
Yeah, no, this is something I've thought about a little, but hasn't featured very strongly in our interviews. So I don't really know whether this would be a useful comment I'm making because I haven't you know processed it in the way that the question has been asked. I think it's an important question. I do want to say that in terms of the interviews themselves, because people are sharing very intimate aspects of their lives, we have a consent form, for example, which says we are going to use the data. They're all anonymized, and we assure them that if they would like to take part in any discussion, they're welcome to do so. And so many people have said that we want to be part of online and offline discussions. We don't mind that people know who we are, etc. Right? I haven't shared a ton of stuff that could not be shared at the moment because we have to also find ways of anonymizing it, so that's difficult. There have been issues of obviously cyber stalking, cyber bullying, and I think once we are able to sort this out in terms of how to deal with it in terms of the forms of intimacy that have are so prevalent today, I might be able to say something more useful perhaps in the next talk. Yeah, but it's a really important question, and I think I will feed it back to the team and see in our next research methods workshop to see how we might take this on board.
Thank you so much, Tejaswini. Yes, I think like all of us are constantly thinking about this, and it would be wonderful to see new perspectives come out from the interviews that you're conducting. Our next question is that we see a digital divide in the middle class India from traditional parents to their urban woke children. And do you think digital mediated conversations apps sort of transcend these narrow urban digitally population, because now that you also gave the example of how kids are speaking to their parents on these apps while living in the same house, so how would you sort of imagine them transcending in other ways as well?
I don't know. I would hesitate to say transcending because I don't think any gap can simply be transcended. But people mediate these difficult relationships, especially between generations, through different kinds of app usage. And emojis, obviously, and memes and GIFs and so on are ways of, and stickers, as much more commonly used in China, for example, are important ways by which people are doing proxy conversations, if you like, right? Which probably won't take as much time as difficult offline conversations, but sending a heart keeps someone connected even across generations. And I think it's again not about transcending them, but about figuring out how this might work. We are not only looking at the middle class, although the class question is very complicated across our locations. We are trying our very best to look at people across sort of class and sexual preference and other, in the Indian case, religious and caste differences as well. It's not a huge number of people we're looking at, so this is always difficult. But we are trying our best so that hopefully when we've done this, it's not a quantitative study. We are trying to bring out the quality of these conversations and what people are saying. So, but even then, I think that we may be able to say something more at the end of our 3-year project, right? But yeah, this is being, like I said, some of my examples spoke to this mediation. You can send a heart to someone, but the heart means something and doesn't mean something also. There are people we talk to who said they never send hearts to anyone. Unless it's hugely meaningful, then they will use the heart, right? But it's so ubiquitous now, right? And it's so easy to say that even for someone you've never met, someone you will never meet, you're hearting everyone. So
Yeah, it's interesting how in real life interactions, it's more about the body language, the expressions, and now this is changing from a heart to an emoji. I mean, it's quite interesting. Our next question also speaks about how relations are formed digitally. And I mean, we do know that there is a certain sense of algorithm that directs the kind of people that you're interacting with online, and again with dating apps as well, the kind of personality you are creating and you are meeting is also certainly sort of directed in the way that the algorithm sort of brings you to. So how would you talk about the realness of such relationships. And I mean, from your study and from your interviews, how would people differentiate this online relationship from an offline setup?
Yeah, I actually don't know because I think that many of these tendencies have become much more pronounced after the pandemic, which is now like our ever after, right? So that's how people are going to relate. And so I don't know if one can give a comprehensive answer to this question. Earlier, like when I was doing interviews from 2017 onwards, they were in Guangzhou and Hong Kong, and they were all offline. And people spoke a lot about meeting someone, frequently, occasionally. Family meals were always once a week, etc. And boyfriends, they would try to meet twice and thrice a week. That is not happening now in pandemic time. So it's changing, and I think the relationship, even as we watch, is changing between online interaction and offline interaction, or the combination or the percentage of time given to each is hugely changing. So we are very aware of it in terms of the interview setting, and we keep asking people about this. We are collecting a lot of information, so hopefully again we'll say something more at in 2 years time. Hopefully the effect of the pandemic would have lessened, and we would have something to contrast it with to see what actually happened in this time. So, but very, very interesting things are also happening about. Let me give you an example of online offline interaction in Singapore. So one of the young women I was interviewing online said that she has 3 or 4 best friends, and they're sort of a semi lockdown, but they're dying to go out and be together, but their parents won't have it, or their family say this is very dangerous, don't go out. So what they do is they order some food, and in order to pick it up, they order a taxi, and they go to each one's house, pick up all of them, and they all go together in the taxi to pick up that dish. And in that time they would have interacted, right? So it is a strange meeting of online and offline interaction. So this I found very fascinating, that people are creating opportunities for offline through the online mediation, in a sense. But many of the people I spoke to in Hong Kong in particular before the pandemic, was everyone was out there trying to meet each other. And they said that we keep in touch with high school friends, with primary school friends, online in groups and in group chats, but we do try to meet once a month or once in 2 months. But in the pandemic, people have not met each other for a year, even living in the same city. So I think that, yeah, it's really, even our questions have taken a beating. So we have to rethink some of them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And also building on these social interactions, how do you think the digital medium has brought about sexuality and intimacy, particularly into our everyday life, considering how traditional Asian cultures usually operate? So, how do you think now is there a shift in agency between the young and the old, or is there, what sort of changes do you see specifically in sexuality and intimacy?
Hmm. Again, I do want to say that we're not looking at offline behavior, we're looking at online behavior. And we are trying to understand how digitally produced intimacy or mediated intimacy is affecting certain phenomena offline. So this is not a study about, for example, intimate relations in the so-called real world, right? So it'll be difficult to speak to that question in the way it has been asked. However, I do want to say that I think I am a little wary about making this distinction between traditional and modern societies, and thinking for some reason, because there's an increase in sexual intimacy, it somehow makes a society modern. I don't quite follow that particular logic. And I think that we are not particularly concerned in our project about making the traditional modern distinction. We are simply looking at how intimacies are being redefined. And many of those are sexual, many of them are not. And I think we need to maintain that spectrum in order to understand even one kind of intimacy over another. So we've tried our best to do that. I do want to say here, which I think is important, that we are trying to do it in some ways across generations, but because our project is limited, funding is limited, we are looking only at young women. But in every single interview, we ask them about their parents' generation, we ask them about their grandparents' generation. Very often, they don't know very much about them. And we try to source as much information as we can about them and about their own choices, so that when it comes to writing up the study, we at least have a sense of how things have changed. So I think I would like to say that with this particular question about sexuality, we would see how, I mean, I think there are always expressions of and engagements with the question domains of the sexual. It's not that it was not there earlier, now it exists. It's always there, but it's mediated differently. So I think that by tracking it, across generations, we are able to get some sense of how the difference is perceived and acted upon.
Some people also want to know about how there is a shift in the digital intimacy over various mediums. So, for example, some people use some apps specifically for sexting exclusively, and some are for informal, casual chats. So, how has this come across in your interviews with the people on ground?
Yeah. So right now we are looking at self-reported usage. So sometimes people may not say what they do really. We have to factor all that in, which is fine. But we also have our research assistants are also online with sometimes declaring themselves as themselves, but saying they're here for research. And they are now increasingly getting very interesting information from these interactions. This has been very, very recent. So, and they are on dating apps, they're on other kinds of apps as well. And they are saying that they are approached differently when they change their profile from researcher to just a person on the site. So the thing is, some of our investigators are somewhat older, and we somehow feel that the RAs who are in their 20s themselves should be the ones on the front line and the firing line doing this. And but we do get weekly reports from everyone, and we are getting some extremely fascinating information that we're still processing. So I don't have anything specific to say about it as of now. But yes, people do use a number of apps, and they do, as I suggested in one of my examples. Sometimes people are using different apps at the same time with the same people. So that can also happen, right? I mean, yes, for people as old as me, it sounds like seriously digital madness. But the thing is, we are also on those apps. We are also completely on them during our waking hours. I don't think age matters.
That's true. And I mean, using these different apps also reminds me of how you were talking about drawing these boundaries around you. And this also brings me to the question that while boundary drawing can sort of give you a sense of security and privacy from your immediate circles, how would you think this boundary drawing can work out in the context of the state and surveillance, and where there is a constant invasion of your privacy and a constant collection of your data?
Yeah, I think that's really hard to draw those boundaries. And the thing is, our young people are aware of them, are aware of this. So they will make their accounts private, or they will find ways of not saying certain things online. And now that there has been, such a backlash in the last year, partly pandemic induced backlash, if you like, people have gone very silent, and they're not really using their Insta accounts anymore. They've closed them down. So you can already see a shift because of the increasing nature of state surveillance. And this is not only in our context, it's across the board. There is a heightened kind of surveillance on the part of state agencies, and which is a slightly different kind of surveillance than the surveillance that Facebook practices. Or because you shouldn't imagine that only governments surveil, right? All the apps that we use are surveilling us all the time. And I think that sometimes people don't want to acknowledge the difference, but increasingly they are acknowledging the difference. And I think they need to balance the exposure, and like if someone's saying WeChat is the Chinese app, she's saying it's like running naked. We know that everyone is collecting our data, but we do want to use the app. So you find coded ways of talking about things. I mean, we all have codes for, especially in intimate relations, right? So why should it be any different if you're trying to conceal something from your parents or from the government?
Yeah.
It's all slightly tweaked in a different way.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, this also reminds me of how, these spaces also become this idea of exercising more sexual freedom, digital spaces, and the way you're drawing boundaries. So does your research and does your data also give you more information about how people are exercising sexual freedoms across different mediums digitally?
Mhm. Again, as I said, it's just ongoing work.
Yeah.
And I don't want to say anything very explicitly at this point. Because again, the questions that we ask are framed in such a way as it's not traditional versus modern, freedom versus non-freedom. We don't have these binaries running through the interviews. So it's difficult to answer a question when asked in this way, right?
Yeah.
So we don't, for example, say, do you feel an increase in sexual freedom because you're using the internet? No, we're just saying, what is your behavior online? How do you think it's changed? So we are trying to do it in a more descriptive mode rather than giving a normative sense of, like these are the concepts we're working with. We're trying to be very non-normative in this project.
And I mean, being non-normative would also like give you more insight on how the East and the Asian was much different from how the Western models would work, right?
Sure.
So has there been like sort of a comparison, any conversation that came out that actually do bring out this West versus East, or a very different sort of perspective to how digital intimacies play out?
Yeah. So you're asking me again a difficult question because I've only been talking about the interviews, but the question you asked me uh, makes me think that I need to talk to my colleagues to figure out how to discuss this. And as I said, let me just repeat this one point, that our project set out to do referencing across Asia. It is not part of our project to do a comparative study with the West. In fact, we're explicitly saying that that is a default mode of comparison, and we all live with it. We are all practicing that mode of comparison in an invisible sort of way. And this is an attempt on the part of our project to deliberately shift that mode of comparison. So we will not anytime soon be doing any comparative study with the West. We are trying to do this to try and surface what happens in these interactions. But because there's a lot of literature coming out of the Western space, in the writing up of the research, we will be, of course, referencing some of these. But the project itself doesn't do it in terms of the interviews.
So somebody has a question about the language that has been used to conduct these interviews. How would that sort of affect what one could learn about the participants? And was English the only language that was used throughout, or did you also sort of depend on regional languages?
Yeah. So English was probably not used so much, except it was more used in Singapore and Bangalore, because of the ease with which young people, tertiary education is in English, etc. Right? Although tertiary education is in English in Hong Kong, most people don't use the language outside the classroom. So it was a mix. When I conducted the interviews, I always had someone with me who spoke either Cantonese or Mandarin, which I don't know very well. I know very little actually. And so I do it in English, and people have enough English to understand what's being said. And I tell them, feel free to respond in any language of your choice, as long as someone translates it for me. So we have someone transcribing the interviews and then doing some translation. So no one in the group misses out on whatever language is used, right? So we always make them feel at ease right at the beginning and say, we will only do the interview in whatever language you are comfortable in. Interestingly, our early interviews in Guangzhou were all in English, because when we asked them what language they preferred, all the interviewees said, we want to be interviewed in English, because it's a certain aspirational language for them and they're all learning it and they want to practice it. They don't get much of an opportunity. And I find that the people in China are far more comfortable using English than people in Hong Kong, which is supposed to have English education, right? Interesting and curious. However, there are many more people we're interviewing now who prefer to be interviewed in Mandarin. So that's the RA does the interviews. We also have investigators who speak all these languages, and they will be doing a certain number of the interviews themselves, and they will be done in whatever language the interviewee prefers. It's probably that, if I as a foreigner do the interviews, Chinese women will say, do it in English. But when a Chinese woman is doing it, they'll probably say Mandarin is fine. So we are still negotiating that, because the bulk of the interviews will be conducted now starting September. Yeah. In Bangalore, which is very multilingual, we've had some interviews in Kannada, Tamil, and Hindi. But as you know, in India, it's very common to be slip in and out of languages in the same space, and that has happened a lot. Then we just transcribe it and translate the bits that need to be in another language. So yes, it's very important to our project that we capture the liveness of this interlinguality, if you like.
Somebody has also asked about, because you're also into textual translation, so how would that be different from when now that you're doing these digital mediated relationships and the translation here? How does that differ from, doing a textual translation?
Well, of course. I mean, they're all shades of translation, I guess. And we're doing massive amounts of cultural translation in having, people who are not from that ethnicity or background interview that person. We're already doing that layer of mediation. So yeah, there are many forms of translation, and it cannot be the same as textual, where the text is at least before you and it's not moving. Whereas when you're talking to someone, you have to be much more mobile than that. And you have to shift your mode of questioning depending on where the conversation seems to be going. So I think ethnography is a form of translation as well, but far more fluid, far more difficult, if you like, than textual translation.
So you also mentioned an example about how somebody was sort of maintaining a different personality on Twitter and then on Instagram, and they didn't want people to know about their political opinions from Twitter on Instagram. So we're also thinking about how, in a larger context, like protests in general, how would that change in digital avenues, and like does our understanding of solidarities or coming together through digital avenues also shift, and were you able to find out from such opinions of people through your interview?
So we were a little cautious about only foregrounding this mode of solidarity building, because we were looking at more intimate relationships than large anonymous public source through for political protests and so on. And also some of this started happening after I had done a bulk of the interviews for the earlier interviews. But and the thing is, again, each space is different. In Guangzhou, for example, there's a long tradition of digital activism around feminism. But that in the last 3 or 4 years, that has been heavily surveilled and curtailed. So I believe that most of feminist organizing and activism has now moved completely online. And because, again, the online platforms are surveilled by the state, whenever something is put up, it can get taken down. But people find ways of sharing it quickly or downloading it or archiving it. So people are extremely mobile. I mean, like, enormous percentage of China's population is online all the time. A lot, even forms of public discussion, public opinion, it's all manifested online. So it's a very different digital ecosystem than what we might be having, because also many more people are literate in China than in India, right? It's well over 90% of the population.
Right.
So that's one form. In Hong Kong, especially, there was in 2019, early part of 20, when before the pandemic, you would know about the protests that took place there. Many young people that we interviewed have been part of them, and already it has sort of receded. So if you're interviewing someone now, they're not talking about it as much. Right now, we are conducting some new interviews, and we are finding some way of tackling these larger historical, political, social questions. How to factor those in relation to the digital intimacy question, and we're trying to understand how these phenomena might pan out in these different locations, because each location is extremely specific. And if we go too much in one direction, it might overdetermine the questions we would ask in the other location. So Singapore, again, is there are all kinds of heteronormativity which pressurize particular forms of intimacy, and also it's not as though you just go out in the street and protest in Singapore or anywhere for that matter. So we have to be careful what kind of questions we ask that allow certain insights to emerge in relation to this. But we are obviously very aware of what has happened. Much of this has come through in the interviews. We haven't put it all together as of now.
Right. Yeah, because we're also talking about like how women across regions has been affected. Have you also come across narratives of trans women in particular? And do you think if you were to, that would really change the dynamics of your research, or how differently would that look like?
Yeah. Because the earlier part was done, in a very different space. In the new interviews, this is one of the things we are looking out for. We are looking for contacts in Bangalore who would help us find trans women in college, which is hard. In an earlier project I did, we were able to find them because we weren't confined to higher education, but it is difficult to find trans people who are able to function and navigate their way through higher education. We are still looking for people who we might be able to interview. They're underground for different reasons in different locations. It's difficult to talk about this in Singapore or Guangzhou, for example, right? But we are figuring out how to do this. We do interview people who have different sexual preferences, and that is very much there in our interviews. We haven't yet put that data together.
I think just maybe time for one last question. Broadly, how do you think like the future of this research looks like? And I mean, I know it's too soon to even tell how it would impact the realm of intimacy studies, but maybe some closing thoughts on how you would think this would change perspectives on intimacy studies.
Yeah, I don't know what is intimacy studies. Probably it's a new field we are entering. I love how these microfields emerge suddenly, and one has to be an expert on those. I'm not one. Okay, I'm just doing something that fascinates me, without any attempt to change any frameworks that have probably already emerged in so-called intimacy studies. As I said, I think that in my group we are very keen to find out how so-called 20th century institutions, and how they've taken shape, family, kinship, marriage, the university. How are these being impacted? How are these seemingly solid institutions being transformed by the way in which intimacy is mediated digitally? This is sort of broadly where we are headed. We haven't yet, moved in that direction, but we're trying to understand that through individuals, through these qualitative interviews. And I think that what our project really brings to the table, although there have been some similar studies in other places, is the comparative inter-Asia aspect. I think that we are deliberately countering methodological nationalism of different kinds. It's not a study of India or Bangalore. It's not a study of China. We are really trying to cut across those. I think that will probably be the most valuable contribution we'll be making in the long run.
Thank you so much, Tejaswini. It's been wonderful having you, and I think I can speak for everybody from the chat box, from the Q&A. We've had quite a lot of engagement from our audience, and I think everyone's excited to see more about this research in the coming times. And we hope to stay in touch with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks
Bye.
everyone for attending.